and once again we have a constitutional dream team. Charles Cooke is editor of nationalreview.com. Ryan Lizza is a political analyst at CNN, and David Schleicher is professor of law at Yale Law School. Welcome, everyone. I do have to apologize, gentlemen. We are a manel, which is not a good thing to have, a panel of men. And our last speaker reminded us of the fact that there may be far less cool reason, and as well as a diversity of views that there would otherwise be. Absolutely. Nevertheless, you have an important job, which is really to squarely debate this question of whether or not the 17th Amendment should be repealed. And Charles, you are unequivocal in the idea that it does represent the death of federalism and it should be repealed. And you've just heard a rather nuanced discussion. Why don't you just raise the heat a bit and tell us squarely in your opening arguments why the 17th Amendment represented the death of federalism and why it should be repealed?
Well, I should start probably by saying I'm under no illusions. We're not on the verge of doing this. When I was on my way here, people asked me what I was doing. I said I was going to talk about the 17th Amendment, and almost everyone said, which one is that? So if you know, I don't believe there is this movement across the land sweeping. Is the microphone not on? I'll just speak loudly. I also don't think it would be an immediate panacea to the problem, in my view, which is that the federal government is too big, and I think the states are being crushed. Sometimes this argument is presented in too simplistic terms in the way some people will tell you, if we just had an Article 5 convention and we could just get the changes I want, then the country would be fixed. The problem, of course, being that if you could get the level of support you would need for that sort of change, we would already have fixed those problems. And I'm skeptical of a balanced budget amendment for that reason. I think if there was a groundswell in favor of one, we wouldn't have a budget problem. What I do think, though, is that it would start to help recalibrate the way in which we see the federal government. I think one of the problems with the 17th Amendment is it removes from the minds of voters the idea that the Senate is supposed to be the place in which the states are represented. And the reason that matters is after 1913, and this wasn't just the 17th Amendment, there was a lot more that did this, including the New Deal, I think we've come to see the federal government as being almost a separate layer. So people think, well, I vote locally and then I vote nationally. And that has led to a mindset in which the limited role of the federal government, and we need to have a federal government, but the role in which the federal government plays certain limited roles that don't really cross over into what the states do, has been diminished. Now, it was suggested on the last panel repeatedly that the 17th Amendment was a good thing because it brought in a more democratic way of doing things. And democracy is a tool. It's one of the American founding principles. But so is localism. And I don't see the Senate and I don't see the pre-17th Amendment status quo as being undemocratic so much as I see it as being a mechanism for enforcing localism. I also don't see the idea that people get to vote on their senator as necessarily being likely to produce better outcomes. I mean, the fact is, as was mentioned also on the earlier panel, that we have a primary system at the moment in the United States that doesn't necessarily produce the best candidates. I know it was at the federal level, but I think the election we just lived through might demonstrate that. I mean, effectively, most people in most states are asked every time, do you want this person that you aren't thrilled by, that a small handful of primary voters has given you, or that person you aren't thrilled by, that a small handful of primary voters has given you? I'm not sure how that differs from a state legislature choosing a candidate and you being angry or not at what they've chosen. I don't see that as being a marked difference, and I also take the point that that was made that we're not really looking at a sea change in outcomes here. It hasn't destroyed corruption in American life. It hasn't got rid of money. It hasn't got rid of the outsized influence of people who are powerful. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that if we were to repeal the 17th Amendment, then the country would go back to the sort of more hyper-federalist structure that I would prefer. There's an awful lot of work that would need to be done to get to that point. And maybe we can talk a bit later about why that is so important to achieve. But I do think that as part of an overall package of restoring the states to their rightful place, that this would be important.
Thank you very much for that fine opening statement. David, you wrote the separate explainer for the Interactive Constitution's explainer on the Interactive Constitution, as well as writing a superb article, The 17th Amendment and Federalism in an Age of National Politics. I'll just ask you to make your opening statement against the repeal of the 17th Amendment, and please bring in all of the rich history that you have on the Interactive Constitution about why you think that far from serving federalism, the 17th Amendment inadvertently undermined it.
So the case that the repeal of the 17th Amendment would be good for federalism gets two things wrong: the 17th Amendment and federalism. Other than that, it's great. The thing it gets wrong about the 17th Amendment has been discussed a little bit, but it's that prior to the 17th Amendment, and certainly it would be the case if the 17th Amendment were repealed, that having state legislatures appoint senators would subsume state legislative elections entirely. That the same way we don't know who we vote for electoral college, we'd also not know who we vote for senator and for state legislature. And this can kind of be brought home with the most famous of all Senate elections, the 1858 election between Lincoln and Douglas. A nation divided against itself cannot stand, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Three things are notable about this election. First, Lincoln and Douglas weren't on the ballot. This is pre-17th Amendment. Secondly, in this grand debate over who would be elected, no one asked any questions like, should we build a road from Chicago to Springfield? Or what should contract law in Illinois be? But of course, these were the questions the state legislatures were going to do every day after they appointed a senator. And the third, and this is important, Lincoln's Republicans almost certainly got more votes in that election than Douglas's Democrats did. But Douglas was elected because of the malapportionment of the state legislature. And so what we see from this story, and this became true, even more true after what people called the public canvass, that state legislative elections became less and less important and less about state politics as we got closer to, and this was central to the case for the 17th Amendment, that on the floor of the Senate, this was a central part of the argument for the 17th Amendment. It was certainly very central to why, as David and Wendy both noted in the last panel, state legislatures were asking for this yoke to be thrown off them. This gets to the point what the argument for repeal gets wrong about federalism, which is federalism is an institutional design tool like any other. So it serves certain ends. And when we think about what the cases for federalism are, we think of things like it creates more responsive policies because democracy is closer to the people. It allows for sorting of people between states. So if you don't like what, you can move between states to get your preferred package of public policies. We think of laboratories of democracy. All of these things are premised on state democracy working, that we have to believe that state democracy is producing responsive opinion. But what we've seen is that even with the 17th Amendment, state legislative elections turned increasingly on national issues. And repeal of the 17th Amendment would kind of put the nail in that coffin. And what we would see is that state legislative elections would be just pure referendums on whether people like Donald Trump. And if you like federalism, and I like it in theory, although not often, sometimes not in practice, you should want tools that would improve state democracy more than you should care about questions of formal state authority. And so even for people who are pro-federalism or federalism heads, they should view repeal of the 17th Amendment as a terrifying idea, or at least a bad idea, because again, how much it would change it, because it would reduce the capacity of state government to produce policies for state residents on state issues.
Thank you. Well, the debate is well and truly joined, ladies and gentlemen. You've heard the argument about why repeal would increase appreciation of the states, and the argument about why the 17th Amendment didn't serve federalism before it was passed, and passing and repealing it would make things worse. Ryan, you are one of America's great political journalists and an old friend, and I was eager for you to join the panel, among other things, because at a panel last summer, you made a fascinating point, which I hadn't thought about, and you said what killed compromise in Congress was tweeting. that basically you found as a political reporter, once Congress people were had to tweet out their positions to serve their most extreme constituents in real time, any degree of compromise between closed doors was impossible, and even the leaks to you were making that compromise difficult. So you can join this important 17th Amendment debate if you like, but I'd love you to just start by describing why do you think that Congress has become dysfunctional, polarized, responsive to the most extreme currents of public opinion, and what could be done about it?
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Let me first just, as someone who has not studied this issue the way that the two of you have and has come to it more recently, let me just offer a few thoughts about the politics of this. Imagine if this idea got off the ground, and imagine if suddenly you had people on CNN and Fox and elsewhere debating should we repeal the 17th Amendment? And I just think it's kind of interesting as a mental exercise to work through what are the politics of this idea? How would it go down? You know, I'm sure people in the audience are thinking, thinking this through. Would legislatures, going back to legislatures, picking our senators? What would that look like? And I mean, I think the first challenge your side has is you need to come up with a liberal case for this. Because right now this seems like this slightly esoteric, crankish idea on the right, and without a lot of liberal support. And so, you know, what is the liberal case for it? And I think you would run in the arguments you'll run into, aside from the ones you laid out from the left, just off the top of my head, would start with who are our state legislatures? A lot of us in national politics and cover national politics don't pay a lot of attention to these state legislatures. And one interesting side benefit of repealing it might be that we would all pay a little bit more attention to what goes on in the states. But, what's that? No, I know, we talked about this in the green room. But there are 7,400 state legislatures in the United States. And they don't really look like America right now. So only 25% of state legislators are women. Women are 51% of the population. Only 9% are African Americans, whereas African Americans are 13% of the population. Only 5% are Hispanic, and Hispanics are 17% of the population. So immediately, this idea would be this massive transfer of democracy from the mass electorate to a very narrow group of 7,400 Americans who would be whiter, and I didn't throw this in, but also older. And in 2018, that just, I think, would be shocking to a great number of Americans that you were going to fundamentally retreat to the old way of picking senators when you have that much of a difference between the mass electorate and the state legislatures. The second argument I think you run into is the state legislatures are 2-to-1, houses and senates, controlled by Republicans. And your idea is not getting off the ground.
Right.
This would mostly be seen on the left as a massive power grab by the Republican Party to control the United States Senate for years and years into the future. And I think the federalism, the sort of theoretical federalism arguments would not be received very well on the left. So there's, off the top of my head, I think those are two massive arguments you'd have to deal with. On your point, Jeff, you know, the thing that we were talking about last summer that I'm very sympathetic to when I look at what are the problems in American politics right now, and this was in the context of the rise of Trump, is the breakdown in intermediary institutions, in the brokers of politics that have such a bad reputation now, but for many years played, I think, arguably a very important role in preventing a certain type of candidate from from rising too high. And we were discussing this in the context of Donald Trump, and how was it that this man was able to take over the Republican Party? And I think the history of going from legislatures selecting senators to the wider electorate is very, very similar to the history of political parties and how they moved from elites having lots of influence in the primary process to basically now a completely democratized small d democracy in our, at least especially in our presidential primaries, where the traditional brokers and leaders don't have much of a role. And I think the tide you're running against, the powerful tide you're running against, you just look at the Democratic Party that is right now thinking about changing its rules, right? And even as the Democrats watched what happened on the Republican side and watched how Donald Trump was able to take over that party, the Democrats are reducing the sort of the role of things like super delegates and reducing the role of elites and party leaders to be a check on certain kinds of candidates. And most Americans, I think, think now that political party primaries at the presidential level should be completely democratized, right? That the parties shouldn't, the party leadership should have very, very little say. So that's the kind of headwinds I think you'd be running into in arguing that, oh no, the state legislatures should take over this process.
Great. Well, Charles, you have much to respond to. Just to sum up, Ryan just said you got this political reality that would look like a Republican takeover by undiverse state legislatures. And although he's sympathetic to the need for intermediaries, there's little popular sympathy for them. And then you have David's points about how the pre-17th Amendment system was bad for federalism, and repealing it would make things worse. So please resurrect the case against
let me run into some
the 17th Amendment.
So I think a lot of what has been said is correct, and the arts.
Good, me too. We're done.
George will set us all straight.
Well, just take them one by one. If I got your numbers right, you said 9% of state legislatures were African American and 25% were women, which is higher than the Senate.
Yeah. The African American number is the best number of all of them.
Right.
It's 9 versus 13.
So, if you did put that intermediary force in, it's not necessarily the case that you would have a lower representation in the Senate of those groups. It would be a hard sell, but I'm not personally convinced that would lead to sort of this old white men outcome. By far and away the hardest thing here, of course, is at the moment, and I don't think this is going to be the case forever, of course, but at the moment it is true Republicans run so many of the state legislatures, it would be almost impossible to get this through, much in the same way as it's going to be very, very difficult to add a 51st state while we're all this angry with one another, because one side would say, I want 2 senators, I don't want you to have 2 senators. I think my argument, as I suggested at the beginning, it does hinge on an argument above it, which I've made in a book, and I make a lot, and I think if I'm right about that, then I may be right about this, and that is that I think that there is going to be a greater appreciation for federalism in America's future, because I think we have reached a point as a nation at which we are so worried about the national government every 4 years and who gets to control it, and thus who gets to smash the other side, that we're eventually going to have to recognize that this is a country full of people who fundamentally disagree with one another, who have different conceptions of the good life, and that too much has been centralized to the point at which, on election night in 2016, people went out into the quad at Yale and screamed into the air. And look, that is not healthy behavior, whoever is made president. I've been around talking on college campuses on the left and the right, and you get this sense from people that they think the other side is going to destroy them, that is going to destroy the country they live in and is going after them personally. And I think something's got to give. And at that point, I think there will be more susceptibility to the idea of localism. Now, whether that would translate to the 17th Amendment, I don't know. But I do think that you are going to see a growing interest in federalism from progressives that will change the way that Americans think about politics. In terms of the focus on national issues in state elections, that is by far and away the strongest argument. And I think it is an extremely good one with which any advocate of repeal has to deal. What I would say is there are some advantages, though, to having people focused on national politics as filtered through the state rather than seeing it as a separate layer. So rather than looking at their local election, who do I want to be governor, who do I want to be in the state house, and who do I want to be in Congress, I do think you would see a greater focus on what a senator being elected would do to Indiana, to Mississippi. By definition, you would see the people who are in charge of the state budget making those arguments to voters, even if you had a primary system of sorts. And that would change things, because that would localize things in a way. But I agree. I think that there would be a real risk of diminishing localization in the name of striving for it.
David, you can put in some more digs against repeal, but I'd love you, though, because I want to get some constructive solutions on the table. In the second part of your article, you say to achieve the benefits for state democracy sought by supporters of the 17th Amendment, election law reform would be more effective than structural constitutional changes. What are some of those concrete election law reforms?
So this is where I think that if people who are kind of have these theoretical debates should really be putting their focus, which is that if you care about federalism, you need to think about how to make state legislative elections work. Because even today, even with the 17th Amendment, state legislative elections track presidential voting pretty closely. And we even report that when the media reports on this is how they report on it. When the Virginia legislative elections happened, no one said, this Virginia legislature had passed this transportation bill that shifted money from southwestern Virginia to northern Virginia. They didn't say anything like that. They said, blow to Trump. And this is the way we understand state legislation is not in reference to what the state legislatures actually do. And you see, even when we see issues filtered through states, we see that state issues don't even matter that much to state politics, even when they're deciding things. So if you imagined that states were focused on the relationship to the federal government in this way, you would imagine when states were thinking about Medicaid expansion under the ACA, that something about the state would predict whether they expanded Medicaid. But that's not true. How many Medicaid recipients didn't matter, how many, anything about the state's economy, didn't matter at all. All that mattered were Democrats and Republicans. And so that the types of things we should be thinking about are ways to make state politics work. And I'll give you a few ideas. The first is greater executive authority inside state government. So one thing we see in state elections is that governors, as opposed to state legislature, their elections don't track presidential politics as closely. And so you see out-party governors. So take Charlie Baker in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has had Democratic legislatures for more than 100 years. Trends go, but nothing changes in Massachusetts legislature. But the governors vary quite a lot. You see this at the local level too. New York City had Republican mayors for quite a while. And so greater executive authority inside states vis-a-vis the legislature would have an effect of making state politics more about the things of the states. Governors can develop independent party brands, independent individual brands that break apart from national politics. Another idea is you could do things by changing the information on the ballot. So most voters have no idea which state controls their state legislature. They have no idea. They have no idea which party. And they don't know anything. They don't know the name of they don't know anything about state politics. We could put on the ballot which party controls the state legislature. We could put on the ballot an ability to rebrand your party at the local level. So one city that even if it just said the Pennsylvania Republican Party and not the just Republican Party, the Pennsylvania Democratic Party, people might make some distinctions in their head between these two things. Even more radically, you could imagine methods for really out-of-power parties to be forced to get ballot access. So ordinarily in most states, ballot access, where the fact that you see Democrats and Republicans on state ballots is determined by vote in gubernatorial elections. But you could imagine systems, firstly, for local elections that forced parties to rebrand themselves. And so you could imagine seeing this in a city like Philadelphia and a city like New York, which have partisan elections. But what you would do was that the out-of-power party would have an incentive to rebrand itself to become something more popular. So in New York, rather than seeing the Republicans, you might see the Bloomberg Party, which was and so that kind of thing would have the capacity to make state elections work. And so I have a lot of ideas. You can see some of them, but the basic move, which is that if you care about federalism, you should be deeply concerned about the mechanisms of state elections seems to me absolutely right. And all this like 17th Amendment stuff is besides the point, or even actively harmful to that.
Thank you for that. I'm taking notes because I'm so eager for solutions, and I'd love some from you, Ryan, as well. In your 2013 piece, How to Fix Washington, you talk about some of them, about what could fix Congress, including shoring up the national parties so they can act as moderating influences again and are allowed to spend more money on individual campaigns. So tell us how to fix Congress.
I mean, that's the great question here, is what is the problem you're trying to solve here? For you, I think it is federalism.
Right.
And when I think about this, it's more, would repeal of the 17th Amendment fix the Senate? And I don't know if that's part of your thinking on this. And would you get better senators? Would you get a more highly functioning Senate? In looking at the senators that actually support repeal of the 17th Amendment, to me, one of the great ironies is one of the few public champions of this is Ted Cruz. And I find that somewhat humorous because Ted Cruz is usually cited by sort of, Senate reformer types as being the kind of senator that you don't want, because he's not a team player, he's all about an independent brand, he doesn't really respect the hierarchy in the Senate, and that if you're trying to fix the Senate or trying to get a better quality senator, Ted Cruz would not be the sort of model that you would point to. He's sort of the modern type of senator that people point to as not exactly what the founders had in mind. And I thought it was interesting in the last panel, most of the commentary was that in the pre-17th Amendment days, the types of senators really didn't change. So maybe this repeal isn't the tool to get a better quality Senate. And rather than, of course, none of us have mentioned the fact of trying to amend the Constitution, just the practical impossibility of that happening. So maybe the reforms are more about party reforms. I do think that, as sympathetic as I am to campaign finance reforms, perhaps they've gone too far, and that some kind of compromise between Democrats and Republicans, there could be some kind of compromise where campaign finance reform actually worked to strengthen parties rather than just push the money to other entities. I think that the parties, in looking at the rise of someone like Trump, both parties should see that history and say, wait a second, the reason we got someone like that is because of weaker parties, and they should be looking at ways to strengthen parties. And that goes for Senate primaries as well. A little bit more on the Republican side, but on both sides in recent cycles, a lot of sort of candidates who would have been pushed out of the way by party elders made it onto the ballot.
Looney Tunes. Yeah.
Right. I'm trying to be diplomatic here at the Constitution Center.
Thank you very much.
There was an article. Some of the pro-repeal commentators looked at what happened in the special election with Roy Moore, and arguing that if you had legislatures, you wouldn't get a Roy Moore type character. But the reforms that I think that would solve some of the problems with Senate, that might make the Senate slightly more productive, would be in strengthening the parties, returning some role to party brokers, people that these extra constitutional scaffolding that helped sort of cool the passions of the electorate that we used to rely on the parties for, but in the modern era really have gone away.
Great. Well, Charles, Ryan is making a Madisonian case for resurrecting the parties, cooling intermediate mechanisms that would choose candidates of reason rather than passion. As a conservative, do you support resurrecting the parties, and are there other reforms that might increase Madisonian reason?
I do broadly agree with you. I mean, I think I thought the Citizens United case was correct on the merits, which is a separate question from whether it had a good outcome or whether you would vote for it. I think that we've been left as a result of it in an odd place. which is that we have weaker parties and almost untrammeled outside influences. And if constitutionally I could find a way of taking some of the ballast that is now under outside groups and putting it back into the parties, I would do so for many of the reasons that you have outlined. I don't know if there's some compromise that could be arrived at. Maybe if the Democratic Party has a disastrous primary in 2020 and they see what happened to the Republicans happen to them, you will see a move toward that. But no, I think there is some common ground there. It's a very tricky constitutional question, though, which is where it's going to run into the mud.
David, anything you like, but national reforms, and the Democrats are on the verge of repealing the role of superdelegates. Should they have more of them?
So I'm very sympathetic to the strengthening party. I don't think it's a constitutional problem because you'd be repealing a regulation. The big regulation is kind of the soft money ban. It's the current extant part of campaign finance that you could repeal. Yeah. But I think you should be cognizant of this is not a silver bullet either. Yeah. So one thing you've seen around the world is that in almost all systems that we imagine would be two-party systems because they have first past the post elections, we've seen the rise of third and fourth parties. That the two-party system in America is basically a complete global outlier in this way. And one of the reasons for this is that the pressures that we see that in other places make for third partyism, even where it's totally feudal third partyism in first past the post systems, are channeled into our parties. And so the stronger we make parties, the greater we make pressure for the outside options. And there's real reasons to think third partyism in an American system is a very, very bad thing, that we have a single president, and so you could end up with chosen by a small minority as opposed to a large minority as chose the last president, the current president, also not too ago. But the fundamental thing is you can imagine these institutional design tools may shift and may strengthen the parties, may have this effect on the margin, but one effect that would drive the crazies to attempt to control the parties themselves. And so you've seen this in some places. So the main Republican Party they had their convention, nobody paid any attention, and a bunch of Ron Paul supporters were the only people who showed up, and they took control of the convention. And you can imagine the same thing happening in any system that centralizes power in the parties. And so ultimately, I think the institutional design tools of this sort can do some good, but ultimately the problem is the rise of radical opinion that we've seen globally and having great problems for democracies around the globe, and that the H.L. Mencken once said, democracy is the belief that the common man knows what he wants and deserves to get it good and hard. Ultimately, polarization is what we want, and we're getting it good and hard.
Why do you say it's what we want?
Because there are parts of us that disagree radically with others of us. There is radical opinion, and that it gets expressed through our institutions. And that's true globally. It's not everybody, but it's enough people that push institutions in certain ways.
Ryan, do you want to take on polarization? Because according to one account, Norbert McCarthy of Princeton says we are more polarized than at any time since the Civil War, as measured by objective measures, but the causes of it are not clear. Some say that it's geographic, self-sorting into red and blue America. Others blame filter bubbles and echo chambers online. Do you have an account for and a solution to the problem of polarization?
It's all of the above. And if you look at the trend in polarization, it looks like historically the sort of post-war period will just be viewed as an anomaly in American history, where we went from incredible polarization through the 18th century, and then we just had this kind of weird period after World War II where the parties were not well sorted, and you had liberals and conservatives within both parties, and that in the 70s starts to decline, and we return to the sort of, what might just be the American norm of intense polarization now, the way it was in the 19th century. I think if you ever look at that chart, it just seems like that one era is actually the outlier. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that polarization, which I agree with you, that's the underlying issue here. and there are no easy solutions. If you believe that self-sorting is the biggest issue, that just geographically we are sorting ourselves into ideologically homogenous communities, then there's really no great solution for that, except forced movement of groups into ideologically diverse communities. Even, I know there's a lot of talk about gerrymandering, and I personally think that gerrymandering is a little bit exaggerated in terms of its effect on politics. There's a lot of political science that shows even if you drew squares in congressional districts into squares, you'd still pretty much get the same kind of House of Representatives you have right now. If you look at the Senate is not gerrymandered, of course, right? Because states vote as a whole. So there's no gerrymandering that goes on in the Senate elections, but the Senate is just as polarized as the gerrymandered House. If self-sorting, the fact that we are in physical communities that are ideologically homogenous is the real root here, then that's a tough problem to solve, which I think goes back to your excellent point about why federalism may be more sympathetic to the left at some point, and maybe not so much the repeal of the 17th Amendment, but a surge in respect for federalism on the left. In that battle, I think your friend is Donald Trump. Sure. Because as many of you have read in the last year, there is a great new respect among liberals and Democrats for this idea that we're talking about today, federalism. Whether it's the sanctuary city issue in many states, especially in California, or a hands-off approach to state marijuana laws where legalization has taken hold, or gay marriage used to be on that list. That's been solved. But when you have someone that is as hated by the left as Donald Trump, there are a lot of people who suddenly have a great deal of respect for local control, and especially in states with Democratic majorities.
So Charles, Ryan is absolutely right, and Heather Gerken, the dean of Yale Law School, was here a few months ago, and she is the leader of the new Federalism for Progressives, and she argues that states' rights and federalism properly appreciated can favor liberal as well as conservative results. And we had just last week this really interesting sports gambling decision by Justice Alito, joined by Justices Kagan and Breyer, a 7-2 decision, arguing that the federal government can't order New Jersey not to repeal its anti-gambling laws, because that's essentially commandeering state legislative practices. So if you were going to make the case, a bipartisan case for why federalism matters to the right and left, what would it be?
Well, I don't like the word solved, because I don't think you solve issues and you solve problems, and I think politics moves, and there's no perfect solution. There are only trade-offs, but I think at this moment in our history, a more federalist system is the best way to dissipate a lot of the anger and upset. And I think that's true for both sides. Now, there are some questions that will always be and have to be federal, and as a result, you can't just wave your hands and say federalism will solve it. Foreign policy is one of them, immigration is another. There are some environmental questions, not all, but some that fall into that category. But most questions actually don't. When about 6-7 months ago, it was revealed that Californians had taken a newfound interest in secession, up to maybe 30% of the state at one point. Yeah. I remember thinking they don't need secession, they need federalism. What they need is to limit their exposure to a President Trump. And that works both ways. That means conservatives get to limit their exposure to a President Obama as well, or anyone else they don't like for that matter. A President Oprah. It is in no way my view that this will solve everything, and it's also in no way my view that it applies to everything. And I should always be clear on this. There are some things that can't be left to federalism and shouldn't. Civil rights is one of them. Elementary constitutional rights is another one. But zoning, education, transport, healthcare, in my view, these questions, if allowed to be controlled more at the state level, I think would take some of the sting out. And no, that wouldn't mean we would all love each other or move into the, each other's states and sing Kumbaya, but it might stop at least some of the anger.
There was a memorable thing you said: a more federalist system would dissipate the anger and the upset. David, is that right? And what does Dean Gerken and the New Federalists say on this matter?
So their position, which is not exactly mine, is that not only would more federalism maybe produce some of the traditional benefits of federalism, but would actually improve federal national democracy by creating a richer set of examples of the federal government. They're not into kind of constitutional barriers for national authority, so it's a slightly different case for federalism than was just made. The question I have about this is the using states as the entity for localism. So there's a case for localism. It's a traditional American case, but we see inside the states the same fight happening. It's just we change teams. So you see in Texas, the state legislature, which is adamantly localist with respect to the federal government, or at least was during the Obama years, suddenly says, well, Austin can't make decisions for itself. And you see this across states. So you see this dynamic happening mostly in Republican states with liberal cities, but you see it in California as well, although it's usually all Democrats, but it's flavors. And so the states are very strange entities for this type of, they have a constitutional pedigree, but states define very little about our lives. So I used to work in Northern Virginia. And in my entire time working in Northern Virginia, I never met anyone from Southern Virginia, from Southwestern Virginia, from Norfolk, anywhere in Virginia. I only ever talked to people from DC and Maryland. You're imbuing the state as this entity in which we can get protection from the federal government, get protection from national authority. But states are odd regulators of economic activity. So New York State doesn't describe anything particularly. Buffalo and New York City have almost nothing to do with one another. Very little trade. It's just if you were doing institutional design ex ante, you would not pick these weirdly designed states to regulate much of anything, nor do they describe much of our political identity. Almost no one thinks of themselves as a Connecticuter, a nutmegger, I don't know, something. And this is the belief that in federalism as we're our expression of political identity has this problem, which is that states, we today do not use states in this way. No one knows anything about state politics, even though they do decide almost everything about those issues. You said zoning, transport, education. Education, 85% of federal money comes from states. Transport, 90% of money. Zoning is almost the entire thing. Healthcare is obviously a little different, but even there, states play an important role in the Medicaid program. We don't use states this way, and part of the reason is that states just don't do very much for us. And so I think there's a case for localism. There's costs and benefits, and we have this long traditional set of arguments about it. But states as the repository of that argument are weird fits. And it may be the best we can do given our constitutional structure and the history, but it's very much cramming a square peg into a round hole. California isn't a thing. It's just not. It's a lot of different things. And so the belief that we should all represent ourselves as Californians or Connecticuters or Pennsylvanians, the old joke about Pennsylvania is that Pennsylvania is James Carville, right? It's Philadelphia on one side, Pittsburgh on the other, and Alabama in the middle. It doesn't describe a political community, it doesn't describe an economic community, it doesn't describe very much other than that at one time this was a thing that came into the Union or was granted a royal charter or something. And so the case for federalism as this protection against our differences runs into the problem that we have big differences inside states. So again, people inside Georgia actively have the same types of problems that we see inside the U.S. government. Atlanta and the Georgia legislature can't get along any better than California and the federal government can, and they feel the same way about one another, maybe even more so. And they're very odd regulators of economic activity.
Okay, Ryan, I think you get the last word.
We don't want to end on such a depressing note.
No.
So it's my job to come up with something optimistic to say.
Well, why don't you're based on what you've heard in this extremely rich debate, since everyone agrees about the passion problem, both sides say that the founders were trying to slow things down and promote reason. What are the best and most productive reforms you've heard so far, and why don't you add any others that you haven't heard so that we can resurrect Madison's vision of a Senate ruled by reason rather than passion?
I'm very sympathetic to this idea of federalism, and that it should not be the province of one side of the political spectrum. I think that has a lot of appeal, and especially in the current political climate. And I disagree with you about the people's identity at the state level. I think it depends on what state you live in and where you are. I used to live in California, and I actually was struck by how many people, I went to a state school in California, I went to UC Berkeley, and I was struck by how many people who came to Berkeley from across the state self-identified as Californian. To me, in a really kind of provincial way, I thought. It's like I just couldn't believe that, they had this view of, the rest of the country as something so foreign. They really had this California identity. So I don't totally agree with you there. And you look at any sports team and the sort of camaraderie and sort of identity that is built around a city's team. But California Angels. There are some state.
Aren't they now the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim or something?
I'm filibustering because I'm trying to think of the
tough
best
question.
reform on what would actually fix
to solve American
Senate.
Democracy in about 1 minute.
It's a number of things. It's one, the thing I talked about before, which is allowing candidates who are shaped a little bit more by intermediaries and not just the mass electorate. It's to allowing, once you get to Washington and work in the Senate, that you have some breathing room to negotiate. Because one of the most problematic things right now about Congress is that negotiation is seen as evil. The idea as an elected representative that you would negotiate with the other side, that is seen by so many voters as something that just shouldn't be allowed. I mean, you have these reports of voters getting angry because they learned of a meeting where a Democrat and a Republican were in the same room secretly negotiating. So, and this kind of pains me to say it because I'm in the business of reporting, and you want, as a reporter in Washington, you want to uncover every word that was said at every meeting, and yet if you're honest, you also have to realize that the intense microscope of the media on the inner workings of Congress has made it much, much more difficult for legislators to do their job. So we are part of that problem. And I don't have a great solution about how you let these folks have the room to make the sausage without showing it, because it's and so that I think those are two things that I think are important.
Well, that's a wonderfully Madisonian point on which to end. The Constitutional Convention, after all, was in secret, and had it not been in secret across them all, then the compromises and thoughtful triumph of reason that it represented might not have been able to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for a vote before our final keynote conversation. This conversation is ranged broadly, but the question on the table is, do you believe that the 17th Amendment should be repealed? You've heard arguments on both sides. Who believes that the 17th Amendment should be repealed? And who believes that it's not? It's wonderful. Who believes it should not be repealed? And who changed his or her mind based on this extraordinarily rich and thoughtful discussion? And whose mind was open to the arguments on the other side? Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 5-minute break before hearing from George Will. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.